Well, good evening, everybody, to another segment of POMP Core Seminar Series, which, as I tend to emphasize every week, deals with various forms of identities, cultural, political, etc., etc. And this week we are actually stepping outside of Poland, or Poland still remains at the center of this whole story, but Dr. Andrzej Polus from the University of Wrocław, who is also the head of the Institute of African Studies at the Wrocław University, is going to tell us more actually about economic and political relations between Poland and sub-Saharan African countries after 1989. So let me briefly introduce our both speakers today. Dr. Andrzej Polus is an assistant professor in the Institute of International Studies. I already mentioned that he is also the president of the Polish Center for African Studies. I should say that his work focuses on current situation in sub-Saharan Africa, NGOs, relations with governments in Africa, natural resource management, theories of international relations, decolonization processes, etc., etc. He holds a PhD from the University of Wrocław, and recently he published Relations between NGOs and Governments in Sub-Saharan Africa, Resource-Dependent States, that came out in Wrocław 2013, Resource Curse or Resource Disease, published here in Oxford in 2013. Polish African Studies at the Crossroad, published in Hamburg in 2012. He also currently manages a research project on resource curse in Uganda. And our discussant today is going to be Patrick Kimunguyi, who is currently an adjunct research fellow at the Monash European and European Union Centre in Melbourne, Australia. He was also a lecturer in European and International Studies in Monash until 2013. He received his PhD in Political Science and Masters in International Relations from the Institute of International Relations, University of Warsaw in Poland. And Patrick's research interests include Europe's relations with the developing world. He's also examining violent extremism in East Africa. Dr. Andrzej Polus, it's to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored that Oxford University spot a peripheral university in Wrocław, and that it is seen that we are proceeding and we are trying to develop African studies in Poland, even though the seminars are devoted to the issue of culture, identity, patterns of behaviors in Central and Eastern Europe. Today I'm going to focus on relations in between Poland and Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm really honored and thank you for the invitation. The aim of this presentation is to critically analyze Polish-African relations after 1989 and evaluate the recent trends in this very relations. And this presentation is basically divided into four parts. I also prepared a paper, so if you are interested in the whole version of the paper, I'll be more than happy to email it to you after the presentations. At the beginning, I will briefly present the Polish-African relations after World War II until the end of the communist period. It is important because that's the major reference point during the political definition of the current state of affairs. There's the meta-narration of returning to Africa, which started briefly 2 or 3 years ago. Then I will distinguish 4 phases of Polish-African relations after 1989, and I will try to contextualize them. The first section will be devoted to the evolution patterns of trade and foreign direct investments, both Polish in sub-Saharan Africa, but also I will mention a few words on African investments in Poland. The last section concludes, and then we'll follow to the plan of this very meeting, questions and answers and discussions. I will try to be brief in order to leave you as much space, because your feedback is the most relevant for me, and that's probably why are you here for. Let me start from a disclaimer. The title says that we can speak about Polish-African relations. However, an attempt to compare Africa and Poland is not justified not only from a the general methodological point of view, but also consensual point of view. How can you compare 1 billion people continent with 40 million people, quite homogeneous nation in Central Europe? And I'm fully aware of that. That's a big oversimplifications. However, in Polish political discourse on Africa, Africa is being presented as a whole, as a unity, as a bloc, and that's why I allowed myself to title this very presentation in this way. At the top of the slide, you can see one of my favorite quotes from Ryszard Kapuściński on Africa, and that's probably all what this quote. So I'm, as a speaker, I'm fully aware about the simplifications that can be present in this very paper. Basically, I used 4 research techniques while working on the paper. The major technique was the critical analysis of the Polish discourse on Africa, and by discourse I mean not only the written texts but also the practice, also the predicate analysis of the phenomenon that exists in current political in current situation in Poland. I analyzed the materials that were provided by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I tried to contextualize them. Direct observation was also one of the methods which was implied, since I was present in few governmental projects. As Dr. Kunicki said, I'm the managing director of Polish Center for African Studies. Were invited for consultations to various projects, so some things were spotted by me, and also Polish Center for African Studies conducted a research among the businessmen who decided to invest in sub-Saharan Africa, and the brief results of this study are presented here. This paper is more a report than an academic paper. But if there is a theory of international relations that I'm most familiar with and that I would use for this paper, it would be social constructivism. However, when I started to work on this project, I made a couple of phone calls to the major Polish professors who are doing African studies, and believe me, there is just a few of them all around Poland, and not a single piece was ever published on Polish-African relations. That's actually the first paper that is trying to summon and summarize the relations in between Poland and sub-Saharan Africa. Before 1989, obviously, Polish-African relations were driven by the Cold War rivalry, and taking long story short, our involvement can be divided into 5 layers. Poland was present during 3 UN missions at the continent. In 1968, Nigeria invited Poland as the only communist states to the observer mission during the Biafran War. At the margin of that, it shall be mentioned that Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Air Force was Jan Zumbach, the legendary commander of the 303 flying squadron during the Battle of Britain. He was also quite active during the secession of Katanga. So some of the Polish troops, some of the Polish soldiers were involved in secession movements as mercenaries after World War II. The second mission was the mission in 1985 in the Horn of Africa during the famine and flood in this region. General Jaruzelski decided to send to send 3 Army choppers and 22 pilots plus some additional staff. It was a humanitarian mission. It is said that Polish pilots saved tens of thousands of lives during the famine in the Horn of Africa. But this mission, beside of the humanitarian reasons, it was also motivated by Jaruzelski's will to improve the international image of Poland. It is claimed that the communist government wanted a spectacular humanitarian success, and this mission was a success as such. In 1988, the UNTAC mission in Namibia started, and that's the biggest Polish military involvement in sub-Saharan Africa so far. More than 400 soldiers were sent to Namibia to work and to support the election process. And this mission is symbolic, since Poland sent its troops to sub-Saharan Africa as a communist state. But when the mission was over in 1990, Poland was a multi-party democracy, and we facilitated the transition of power from South Africa to Namibia. The number of our civilian observers was also around 50 people, and that was the biggest national group who participated as civilian observers during the missions. If you look at 4 ships, there was more than 2,000 Polish soldiers and observers who were involved in this process, and the signs of Poland's presence are present in Namibia. We were also quite involved in the support to SWAPO in Namibia and MPLA during its struggle with UNITA. Over 100 SWAPO fighters were given medical treatment in Poland. Also, the education to their children was given by the Polish government. We sell some arms to MPLA. The third layer of involvement were credit actions. Poland gave 3 preferential credits one to Sudan, $50 million, one to Mozambique, $90 million, and one to Angola, $140 million. If you compare these numbers with the current Polish overseas development aid, so the current Polish development aid looks like peanuts when you compare it with the money that were given to Africa under the communist regime. There were some infrastructural investments, the factories that were being built in Ghana, the technical assistance that were provided to African states, and also the educational and technical cooperations was flourishing in that time. I can give the example of Nigeria, where 3,000 Polish doctors, technicians, constructors were present constantly during the communist time, and also the cooperation in between Africa and Polish university started, and the Centers for African Studies was also settled down at the University of Warsaw in 1967 by Jan Strelcyn. Anyway, this is important because right now the Polish government, the Polish businessmen are saying that we are going back to Africa where we were present. And that's the major reference points when people are trying to define itself towards the continent where for the last 25 years we literally have very little or no relations with. After 1989, everything has changed. I would say that Poland's strategy's interests were in the environment of multivariative uncertainty. We are uncertain what will happen on our western border. There was a puzzle how reunifying Germany will behave. The Soviet Union was collapsing. There was an uncertainty about what will happen on our eastern border. And also we are undergoing the transformation. And there was also, it was uncertain in which directions the developments will go. And the major and strategic aims of Mazowiecki government were twofold. First of all, Krzysztof Skubiszewski, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, wanted the guarantees that the Oder-Neisse line will not be challenged by unifying Germany. And people forget about this quite often today, but it was not so certain in 1999 that the Germany will not challenge this very border. Helmut Kohl, during the mess in Krzyżowa, which is a symbolic reunification in between Poland and Germany, he was absolutely quiet about the border. And the Landesmission in Germany were quite strong, and it was the election base of CDU, CSU, and Skubiszewski put a lot of effort in order to sign a treaty in 1990, and in the treaty it was said that Germany accept this very border. The second aim was to ensure that Poland will be able to conduct a sovereign foreign policy in international milieu. It might be argued, and it is argued, for example, by Eva Thompson. I think that this issue was touched during the previous seminars here, that Poland can be defined as a peculiar post-colonial state. Maybe we can develop this issue later on during discussion, but if we accept that the lowest common denominator of being a post-colonial state is the experience of victimization by the foreign power, so this definition is probably fulfilled by Poland. However, the only issue that is in common between Poland and sub-Saharan states is the obsession with sovereignty immediately after independence, and that will be another oversimplification that is being used by the politicians in a discourse that we are similar, because Poland suffered a lot. First of all, from the Nazi Germany during World War II, then from the Soviet Union, same suffered due by the colonial power. So we have something in common. Poland never ever had the colonies. You also didn't. Well, it doesn't mean that we didn't want to have the colonies. I just want to remind you that during the interwar period, we had the Ministry, Poland, of Colonies and Overseas Possession with no colonies. But there was a desire, and the Colonial League was probably the biggest NGO ever created in Poland with 2 million members. We are constantly collecting money in order to buy certain colonies overseas. We are not the part of the scramble for Africa, because Africa has already been scrambled. But I would bet that if Poland would have been at the map of Europe, we would possess certain colonies. So during this first period, which is 1989-1993, our aims, Polish aims, were absolutely different, and nobody wanted to focus on sub-Saharan Africa. And it was mirrored in the first waves of Polish diplomatic mission closure at the continent. 4 embassies were closed in this very period. You must also remember that this uncertainty connected with Soviet Union and then Russia foreign policy is important in terms of the Soviet troops that were at the Polish territory. We had 50,000 soldiers present with their facilities, with a lot of equipment, probably also with the nuclear weapon at the territory. And the government needed to do everything was possible to get rid of the soldiers from our territory. There was just no time, not energy, and no focus on Africa. On the other hand, Poland was undergoing the economical transformation, and one of the core roles of Balcerowicz plan, or Sachs-Lipton plan as it is being, or shock therapy as it is being called, was that the government need to cut down all the necessary investments, and the investments in sub-Saharan Africa were perceived as an unnecessary one. In 1993, in September, the last Soviet soldiers left Poland, so there was also a change of the government. The former communists, who were then social democrats, returned or were elected, and the new government put new aims and objectives for foreign policy. Poland wanted membership in NATO and in the European Union, and there was a focus on accession to these two organizations. I would say that political class in between 1993 and 2004 for the decade perceive Polish accession to European Union and NATO as a holy grail and a public good. Nobody questioned. There was a practice of not questioning foreign policy that is being led by the government. It changed now. Right now, the foreign policy is being questioned from all sides. But it also led to the practice of defining Polish foreign policy in terms of Euro-Atlantic terms. So that was our aim. I started my study in 1998, and there was over 25 candidates for a single place at the University of Wrocław, because the University of Wrocław was teaching European integrations, and there was a lot of hopes that all these people would be employed by European institutions. Everybody believed that European Union, that this aim will be fulfilled. After accession to the European Union, I don't want to paraphrase here Dean Acheson's statement on United Kingdom that after World War II UK lost the empire and did not find the role, but it was quite the same with Poland. The major aim was achieved and Poland needed to redefine itself, and there was a big vacuum in terms of the foreign policy. Poland wanted to establish itself as an architect of the Eastern neighborhood policy of the European Union. Poland wanted to support the democratic reforms in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, or Belarus. How it, what was the end of that? That's probably for the other lecture. But these policies failed, and at the peak of this process in 2008, Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski decided to close another 4 Polish embassies in sub-Saharan Africa. So it means, in the meantime, we opened the embassy in South Africa because we had no relations with South Africa under the communist regime. But in 1988, Poland has 7 more diplomatic missions in sub-Saharan Africa than nowadays. But in 2013, something has changed. In 2013, Africa started to be perceived as a new place where Polish business can go. There were the very first President Kwaśniewski visited South Africa, but it was correlated with international gathering. But there was the first visit of Prime Minister Tusk to African tourneys. There was the intensifications of intergovernmental consultations, and business started to perceive Africa as a place when the money can be made. This narration of the hopeless continent was replaced by the narration of the continent of hope. The government also created the program Go Africa, which supports Polish investments in Africa. Anyway, the analysis of the data that are provided by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are showing that there are multiple actions that are being taken by the Ministry of Education, because certain scholarships are granted for the Africans, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for the Ministry of Economy, but these actions are absolutely uncoordinated. Every ministry has different aims, different objectives, different tools, and nobody literally speaks to no one. If we turn to the economy, as I said, in 1989, after 1989, Poland was in front of the reshaping its patterns of trade, and the investment in sub-Saharan Africa were perceived as unnecessary one. We shifted towards Germany. In total, Polish trade with sub-Saharan Africa, with Africa actually as a whole, is less than 1%. In 1970s, at the peak of our relations, it was just 1.5%. And I think that there is one investment that discouraged Polish entrepreneurs for investing in sub-Saharan Africa. It was the Polish copper giant, that's the 4th biggest copper producer in the world, KGHM Polish Copper. In 1996, KGHM decided to invest $40 million in sub-Saharan Africa, in Congo, and this investment was an absolute failure. They lost the money, so people started to think that if KGHM, with its knowledge, with its resources, lost this money, why shall we go there? And nobody's actually willing to say why this money were lost. I have some interviews with the insiders. There were some bribery issues. There was the safety concerns. The mining licenses were not provided properly by the Congolese government. And when KGHM decided to close its operations in Democratic Republic of Congo in 2009, there was no Polish embassy there because it was closed 2 years before by Sikorski, who would support Polish firm in this very difficult period. If you look at the graph, we can see a steady increase of trade between Poland and sub-Saharan Africa, but it also shall be seen in the context. Within the same period, the trading between European Union and sub-Saharan Africa increased by over 100%. The trade between China and Africa increased by 700%. The trade between US and Africa increased by 100%. So this 50% growth is behind the global trends in terms of trade with Africa. But if you look at our major trading partners, the situation looks even more gloomy. Because when you remove the North Africa and South Africa from the picture, the whole trade with Sub-Saharan Africa is just $1.5 billion. South Africa is our major trading partner with $1 billion US dollar trade a year. And obviously, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Economy is saying that the trade with Zambia increased last year by over 40%. The same with the trade with Nigeria. But we've got the trade volume at $10 million. Next year we've got $15 million. It's rather a low base effect. Whether this low base effect has a potential to be transformed into a snowball effect, well, it's everything but clear. But we are in this trend for the last 2 years. In which direction it will go, it's quite uncertain, also because of the political situation in Sub-Saharan Africa. In 2012, the gospel of Africa rising has started. Right now, we are rather saying about the Africa of two speeds, that we've got Ghana on one ankle, states which are economically and politically stable. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Central African Republic, we've got Somalia, we've got the cases of Ebola. Of course, we shall not spread these examples at the whole continent, but during the last 2 years, also a lot of bad things happen at the continent, which might discourage the investors. But anyway, the level of Polish investments during the last 2 years is absolutely substantial when you compare it with the previous year. And I prepared a few examples of the most recent Polish investments in Sub-Saharan Africa. Grupa Azoty, which works in the chemistry, decided to buy a mining license in Senegal for almost $30 million, and they are actually mining the phosphorite in Senegal, and they are planning to open a phosphorite oxide factory there. ASECO, which works in IT industry, signed a $10 million contract with Ethiopian government in order to provide IT solutions for Ethiopia. Ursus, which produce tractors, signed a contract with Ethiopia, and they are selling 3,000 tractors to Ethiopia. And this narration of returning to Africa is especially relevant in terms of Ursus, because under the communist regime, under the Mengistu, some tractors were being sold to Ethiopia, and Ethiopians know this mark, and they prefer it more than the Chinese tractors. Ursus also struggled with the Chinese companies who wanted to provide the tractors simply at the better prices. Isodon 2000 also signed a contract with Zambia. That's why our trade with Zambia increased so vastly during last year. That's a $10 million contract. They are planning to build a factory of houses and 20 houses at the outskirts of Lusaka. Lubava is selling protective clothing and tents, especially to Nigeria, but they have also tiny contracts in Ghana and Zambia. And last but not the least is the Kulczyk investment. Kulczyk, who is the wealthiest pool, but he's an investor. He doesn't own the factory. He doesn't own any branch of industry. He invested hundreds of millions of dollars into various projects in mining industry in Sub-Saharan Africa. He has a shares in Nakonde. He has a shares in Opir Energy. Opir Energy has 18 oil wells all around the shores of Sub-Saharan Africa. He also owns 3% of actions of Submiller, and Submiller owns 38 breweries at the continent. So Kulczyk investment was the first one. In 2011, he started to invest in Africa, and I think that he broke the course of KGHM, because the others saw that if Kulczyk is deciding to go there, why shall we not follow this path? Also, because of Jan Kulczyk, the Council of Polish Investors in Africa was created last year, and this council is a gathering of over 20 businessmen who decided to be present at the African market. And during the last few weeks, we proceeded with a survey among these businessmen, and if we asked them about the biggest difficulties, the biggest challenges while investing in Africa, and their answers are quite the same as the answers of other interpreters who are present at the continent. First of all, these are multiple infrastructural problems like the weak internet connections, traffic, constant shortages of energy, corruption, unclear legal and technical regulations, hard competitions with Asian companies, some security concerns, and limited numbers of Poles who would like to work in the African branches of Polish initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think that the most important message from this survey for me is that the mental Rubicon has been crossed by the Polish businessmen. Nobody is saying right now about on Africa in terms of the hopeless continent, and you've got the cover of the economics from the 90s, from the disastrous decade for sub-Saharan Africa. Rather, they are following the path of this gospel of Africa, Africa rising, Africa as a new economic frontier, and they are unwilling to withdraw their money from the continent. Actually, all of them are claiming, or the vast majority of them, I should say, that they are applying new investments at the continent, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put a new aim that in 2018 Polish total trade with sub-Saharan Africa shall be 3% of our trade. There are also some other layers of cooperation in between Poland and Africa. Polish bilateral aid is just $5 million, and we are the last OECD country in terms of the amount of overseas development aids to the ratio of GDP. I said already about the lack of coordinations in between our ministries. There is a lot of potentials for the university cooperation in between Poland and sub-Saharan Africa, but until today our biggest achievement is that Polish scientists are present in South African Large Telescope project. Poland financed, that's the biggest telescope in the Southern Hemisphere, and Poland paid 11% of the cost of this telescope building, and that's why our astronomers have also 11% of time and they can use for their own purposes. And also the Namibia Fishery Academy in Angola is being co-organized by the Gdynia Maritime University, Navimor, and Remontowa Shipyard. There were some contacts in between Stellenbosch University and Polish Academy of Science, where the South African political transformation and Polish transformation were being compared by Ursula von Böcke and Edmund Wnuk Lipiński. There's also a lot of unused assets. And I think that the human resources are the most important unused assets by the Polish government. According to the data that were provided by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is more than 4,000 Africans who graduated from Polish universities. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is trying to organize the meeting or to creating the alumni network. And they are trying it for 2 years without a success. The first meeting was to be in Warsaw last year. This year the meeting is planned to be in Addis Ababa. However, somehow they cannot reach these people. The other assets are Polish missionaries. The missionaries are in sub-Saharan Africa from obviously different reasons than promoting Polish trade and Polish foreign policy. But from my personal experience, whenever you go, there you will find a Polish missionary somewhere in the regions. And these people know they know a lot about the local environment, local circumstances. They don't need to promote the trade. They just can say something about the circumstances where you are planning to do your business. And there are also some rhetorical assets that can be used at the level of rhetorics. About the presentation of Poland's post-colonial states, I already said, but also African helped Poland a lot during the World War II. Many people from the Anders army were hosted by the African states. And not many people remember that South African pilots were supporting the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, and they suffered a lot of casualties. There is also effect of freshness. I was present during a couple of meetings in between Polish businessmen and African businessmen, and believe me or not, but the atmosphere during these meetings is absolutely different than during other gatherings. We have no colonial baggage, we have no relations at all, and people can talk as equals. And it shall be coined into increase in trade. Unfortunately, and I'm going to the conclusions, Polish-African relations are not institutionalized. There is no Polish-African, there is no forum for Polish-Africa cooperations. We have obviously we shall not compare Poland with China, India or UK, but we shall compare ourselves with Singapore, Iran of Malaysia, and such intergovernmental forums of cooperations exist there. There are informal forums during the European Economic Congresses in Katowice. There's informal forum of Polish-African relations. There's informal forum in Łódź during the African Congress that is being organized, but nothing on the level of officials. Additionally, there is a visible lack of long-term vision and well-defined aims towards Africa. Everybody wants to do something, but nobody is coordinating them. And the last thing is probably the something which gives a lot of hope, because the perception of Africa among Polish politicians and among Polish businessmen has changed dramatically during the last 2 years. When you will go to Polish strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, which was published in 2004, this strategy starts in terms of Joseph Conrad Heart of Darkness, that Africa is actually a hopeless continent, marred with conflicts, and there's actually nothing what we can do about it. Right now, people are saying about the continent of growth, continent where money actually can be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very informative. Patrick.
Well, thank you, Andrzej, for your presentation. I think it's been an excellent overview of the historical relations between Poland and Africa. And I'm also glad that you've highlighted all the pressing problems, perhaps, in this relationship. Just to begin, my view is that, like a person who studied in Poland in the 1990s and also witnessed those transformations, because I got there in 1990, etc., lived through up to 2004 before I left for Australia, witnessed all the transformations. It would be, I think, difficult to expect, and you agree with me, it would be difficult to expect, and you've talked about it, it would be difficult to expect Poland to prioritize Africa in our external relations, within this time, at a time when she was undergoing her internal political transformations, and also in our foreign policy issues of accession to the European Union, to the structures of NATO, etc. She had to take some directions first, before she would embark on another direction, which is perhaps taking place right now. Not sure what to say, but perhaps maybe we can understand Poland, we can understand that particular trend. The other thing is, also at that time, Africa was not very attractive to foreigners, and it's not just the Polish part of it or any other, but you see, the Cold War had ended, and it was at a time when the superpowers, as the Cold War powers, had retreated. These resulted in very many crises, very many political instabilities, which sometimes ended up in violent conflict. So nearly every 2 weeks or every month, unlike now, you had of conflict erupting somewhere, etc. So those were serious political problems. And also on the economic front, there were problems, which in fact led to the IMF and the World Bank to get engaged into the continent, in most countries, in fact, with structural adjustment policies. And these policies, at that time, many of the elites, and both from the West, as the World Bank, the IMF, and those who were playing important roles in structuring those economies, they talked about a kind of trimming and so on and so on. So it was very difficult. Now, when you bring in other issues to do with the governance issues, etc., and the expectations from the West, like from the European Union, which all of a sudden also began drafting new programs and new approaches towards Africa, that was really a difficult place to do business. And I'm not surprised that KGHM had issues there. And in fact, in Congo, where Mobutu, I smiled when you mentioned the Congo, because when you think about Mobutu, of all the countries, the DRC, then that was definitely something that they took a very, very big risk. That's my view. But as you've said also, the new millennium, Africa is not the same as it used to be. This wave has reached Poland right now, but it's also has undergone, as you said, transitions that we are actually talking about, and they are also happening in Africa. We're talking about Africa Rising, etc., as a hopeful country, and so on. For a while now, we know very well that Africa has been experiencing tremendous economic growth. 6 or 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing countries or economies have consistently been in Africa. Among them, of course, Rwanda. I think there was an agreement that was recently signed between Rwanda and Poland. I think it was last year or something. It's a very recent agreement, actually. The Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, and much of this growth has actually been fueled by the exploitation of the natural resources that you've talked about. I mean, the gas and oil, etc., and the minerals. And the economies are also structured differently today. So not very many of us know that services, for example, contribute to 60% of the overall African GDP. It is these new areas, such as telecommunications, in which one of the Polish companies has invested, for example, in Ethiopia, infrastructure development, manufacturing, that are currently attracting the majority of foreign investment. So some of, in fact, those issues or those areas that are being cited by the Polish businessmen are the critical areas of intervention and areas that are opportunities for the Polish businessmen to enter and trap. Most of the countries are also increasingly politically stable. I think you also agree with me on that. And the business climate has also been improving as countries streamline their rules and their procedures. It is easier, much easier now to set up a company in many countries. Most countries allow foreign businesses to do business in their territories. We've got certain economic zones that are increasingly luring investors. Corruption, although still a problem, is also more controlled. Rwanda, for example, is virtually clear from corruption. It's nearly put down to a minimum, and it has become a very, very attractive area of investment. So if you ask somebody what they thought about Rwanda, perhaps they would talk about the genocides, etc. So there's also a question of misperception here and lack of information with when it comes to people about what's actually happening on the ground there. Also, Africa is a huge market, of course, with a growing middle class, and that middle class is hungry for better lifestyles and for foreign products. and this presents an opportunity for foreigners, for foreign and of course including Polish companies that could do well selling their products and services to Africa today. It's a very young continent. Its young societies are predicted to be, the world's largest pool of labor in the near future. I think by 2025, this is something that we will be actually seeing, and it's going to be, in fact, bigger than India, in fact. So foreign companies are realizing this, and they are quickly are realizing this asset, and they are quickly, getting into entering the African markets, not only to find those buyers for the products, but also to produce their, products. And they hope, of course, that at the end of the day, they will use the productive capacity of the African young societies, and this is very, very clear, especially if you look at the case of Ethiopia, for example. I mean, this is really, really happening, and the Chinese are doing this very well. So, a question that may come to mind here is, say, for example, if the South Koreans, Samsung can produce laptops and smartphones in Ethiopia, why not Ursus? And I'm glad that I saw that they've begun doing the same, not because I lived in Ursus when I was in Warsaw, but it's also because of the tractors, and having come from a farming family, I think I find that a very attractive company there. Now, Africa has been immensely attractive to emerging economies, and China, of course, is an example here. India, for example, they are at the head of it, and they've not feared the harsh conditions, or African conditions, or challenges that are presented. Okay, and some of the the boldest and the people who have not feared these, you've also mentioned in Poland. I'm happy and I'm glad that this is happening. Like Kunicki, for example, are going, and they've provided this example that, well, look, if we can go, and others are also following suit. Okay, and I think, of course, they've won the game, and they've won it against the West. They've been rewarded very well because of the optimism and hard work, or perhaps the commitments that they have. Their companies, in fact, are some of the world's biggest and richest companies right now today, and this is something that is very evident even from a Western country perspective. And some of the companies have used Africa as perhaps a training ground, especially when you look at some of the companies that went to the South Sudan, for example, to invest in the oil and gas industries, for example. I mean, they went to Africa as, they've used it as a training ground because it's from there that they learned their global aspirations, perhaps, or to went ahead and accomplished their global aspirations, let me say. So this is also important. So if there is any lesson or example that for a Polish businessman, let me say now, then the Chinese and the Indian experience is a good one to have a look to take. Now, coming back to the Polish-African relations, the democratic transitions in Poland and its accession to the European Union have, in my view, and this is in fact also, this is what I think, have laid a new opening in Poland's relations with Africa. I mean, a sentiment being echoed indirectly within the Polish elite, because they see what other countries, or perhaps other countries in the West have got. Well, apart from the other emerging countries that beyond Europe that are launching their ventures in Africa. And this has provided new possibilities and instruments to act in Africa. So the areas of trade, for example, the negotiations that have recently been finished. I mean, they add certainty to the activities that they would be going, that they would be undertaking. So you've also flagged up the question of development cooperation. So the figure that you gave was a bilateral one, that Poland at bilateral level, for example, would prefer to help her eastern neighbors, Ukraine, etc., and realize her commitments towards Africa, for example, through the multilateral channel of the European Union. And this is actually extremely important. So I was doing same research and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's exactly the kind of explanation that I was given by, I think, Mr. Savitsky, who was advising the Polish Foreign Affairs Minister at that particular time. And well, for me, I found that a bit, in one way or the other, from a developmental perspective, logical. The Cotonou Partnership Agreement, the EU-Africa Joint Strategy, the crisis management, climate change, migration, etc. Now, we don't really know what consequences joining the European Union has had on Poland's relationship with Africa. And I would only point out here, because the literature is not saying this very clearly, it's less research that has been undertaken. So I think that it's critical also to kind of look at it from that particular direction. Now, Poland is not alone in Africa. Just about to finish because Mikolaj is saying I've got to try and finish quickly. Poland is not alone in Africa. It's an emerging actor in Africa, just like the other countries, Singapore and so on, Malaysia and so on. Okay. And I say so because, well, look, there are these alternative choices that the Africans can go to. And it's a bit tricky here for Poland, in my view, that if, going there as a European EU country can also be challenging, because most Africans are not very happy about having the Europeans whom they've perceived from our research that we conducted some time back, whom they've perceived to be a bit patronizing, because we did this kind of research a couple of years ago, where we found that most African elites are not happy about the way the EU has conducted itself. Okay, so it is actually important. So in that way, so which other aspects could it be? So it's necessary, in my view, to cut off. Let me talk about the diaspora, which you actually mentioned. I do, of course, support the idea of the diaspora. That's using the African diaspora. That's the graduates, people who graduated from the universities in Poland. I know some of them who run banks in Africa. There are others, of course, presiding over universities, etc. So it's also a very good channel to go. I know it's difficult to get hold of them, perhaps, but they are there. So they are, and also in Poland, and this could be a very good, useful asset. Some of the trips that you see that were launched pretty recently. When you look at the trip to Zambia and the relations that are taking place with Zambia, and also even Nigeria partly could perhaps be explained by the MPs that were there. Mikolaj is apolitical, but just to mention. But they've played a lot of roles, I think, in strengthening this relationship. So taking it to that would be good. Just a question to finish, perhaps to lead into the discussion. What about the other EU member states, for example? That's if you've got some views, say, for example, about the Czech Republic. Do they have the same experience like Poland in their relations with Africa? So perhaps I should finish there. So I had to cut it short briefly.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I promise I'll be brief. Going to the beginning of your comments, I'm not quite sure whether demographic growth will be coined into a demographic dividend in sub-Saharan Africa, because we had the examples of Singapore, Malaysia, the emerging Asian tigers who in the 70s and 80s coined demographic growth into a demographic dividend, but all of them introduced the programs that aimed at reduction of the number of children in and such a programs literally does not exist in sub-Saharan Africa, and the predictions are saying that critical mass will be reached within 2025. So it's the moment to introduce these programs right now. Africa is growing, and that's true. My major field of research is the natural resource curse in sub-Saharan Africa and the management of natural resources. Growth does not equalize with development in sub-Saharan Africa. But the truth is, and I absolutely agree with you, that the situation is changing. And I can say it from my own experience. Zambia 3 years ago is absolutely different Zambia than today in terms of infrastructure, in terms of people who were being taken to the middle class, but also the definition of the middle class is a buzzword in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of challenges. I should probably mention in my presentations that we have two black coming from Africa MEPs, Kilian Muniama from Zambia and John Godson from Nigeria, and that's not the accident that Prime Minister Tusk visited Zambia and Nigeria. There is also a parliamentary working group on Africa with 30 MEPs, and they organize the African Day in the parliament. These are the tiny little things that facilitate the mutual cooperations. And there's also a Polish diaspora in Africa as an asset. There's 12,000 Poles living in South Africa who can be used in terms of the people who are graduated from Polish university. There are even the president, Alpha Omar Konare, is graduated from the University of Warsaw. In Namibia, I spoke to the Minister of Planning, who was graduated from Polish university. So it's just
in Rwanda as well. So there's a minister there. So
in terms of the other experience, probably Czechs are the best in rediscovering Africa, because Czechs organize the forums on the intergovernmental level, and the African prime ministers are visiting Prague. Czechs are also managing their overseas development aids better than the Polish. The amount in nominal terms and also in terms of the ratio to GDP is way bigger than the amounts that Poland's allocate for the overseas development aid. Czechs also have more embassies in sub-Saharan Africa. It might be devoted, it might have its roots in the Cold War policy, because during the Cold War, every state of the Soviet bloc was responsible for intelligence actions in various areas of the globe, and Polish intelligence was especially active in the Middle East, while Czechs were present in sub-Saharan Africa. So it might explain the number of Czechs, and that this 4 times smaller nation than Poland have more diplomatic missions in sub-Saharan Africa than Poland. I think that we should learn from them. I think that the path they chose is a proper one, and it's especially important in terms of the things that are that are taking place at the Ukraine, and in terms of the embargo on Polish agricultural products, in terms of the embargo that is introduced by Russia. We need to internationalize, we need to sell the products overseas, but we also shall, if we have a carte blanche in our relations, then we should attract also African investment in Poland. It shall not be the relations when we are only selling and look at them as the consumer of our products. But the only sub-Saharan African is Poland. They are almost exclusively from South Africa. There are no other African investments in Poland. although there is a potential for African investments in Poland. When you look at Dagonte, who is investing in the European, even you look at the Egyptians who are investing in Europe, there is a potential. We just need to attract them in order to make this relation mutually beneficial. I know that it's really big words, and it might be seen as a wishful thinking. But if we are starting from the level 0, we can do this properly.
Thank you both. If I may actually throw a couple of comments, and one is more like an anecdote than a comment. If you remember the Relax comic book from the 1970s, I'm old enough basically to remember this. In 1975 or 76, there was basically one of the comic stories dealing exactly with the MPLA in Angola, but without Polish troops or military instructors. But one more serious comment. You're absolutely right, actually, about this lost period in terms of Polish foreign policymakers trying to redefine basically the aims, trying to find basically a sort of global niche in Polish foreign policy. Couple of years ago, I attended, I think, one session at Chatham House, and I asked exactly the same question to the gentleman whose name I can't recall, and he essentially told me that, well, you've got solidarity, perhaps, your niche should be, human rights. And then what blew into our faces was the disaster with the CIA secret prison in Poland. So obviously this is really gone. But two very, very factual questions, because I'm completely ignorant in these matters. First one concerns actually Polish contributions to either UN-led or other aid programs actually that focus on Africa. I'm completely unaware of what's going on actually on this specific front. And the second question actually has to do more with Poland and with the domestic perception of Africa in Poland, particularly with respect to incoming immigrants. I know that this is happening basically on a very small level, but nevertheless it has started. So does this 2013 political economic paradigm shift have any impact basically on the domestic perception in Poland?
Thank you. In terms of Polish contribution to UN, and it's also the World Bank, the IMF, and European Union funds, is worth over $150 million. But still, if you want to proceed because that was the rationalization for the lack of Polish African policy in the first decade after the eastward enlargement of the European Union. The Prime Minister's office said, because these questions were being asked, why are we not helping in the places where there is a real need for help? Because it was very easy to shift the money from Belarus to Afghanistan when our troops were sent there. There's no problem with putting millions of zlotys into the building, schools, hospitals, and providing the help in the places where our political interests are vital. We want to support our troops. We want to. So why cannot we do this in terms of Africa? If you want to utilize the European Union African policy, but there is no African policy of the European Union because the European Union is not a unilateral actor. You need to know how you want to use European Union in order to proceed your own African policy. If you don't have this policy, then you cannot. Some projects will be done, but nobody will ever connect them with Poland. So I don't see a problem in shifting the funds, because it's also the very moral questions. Why are we providing the help? When you give somebody a help, you are also obliged that the consequences of your actions may be disastrous, may be really good. You are taking that. That's the question. Shall we help in the areas which are in need, or shall we help in the areas where our vital political foreign interests are placed? Right now, probably nobody knows how to organize Polish overseas development aid, because, as I said, there are 5 priority countries for the bilateral for the bilateral aid in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are absolutely different. That the 5 priority country of the program Go Africa, there is no correlation in between the ministries. Obviously, the number of the amount of money that is put into the World Bank, UN, European Union is way bigger than our bilateral aid. But I don't see a point in. Of course, there's a point in helping in providing some trainings in Belarus or Moldavia, but the ratio that is being given to the Eastern European states and to the Africa is absolutely not right, at least from my perspective. In terms of your second question, I think that there was a paradigm shift only among the businessmen and among the political class. In terms of the common perception of, if I may use this word, of Africa, not much has been changed, and the scandals when there was the Simon Mole famous case in Poland when an immigrant from, I think it was from Senegal, was infecting Polish female with HIV. There is also, as during the crisis years, the far right-wing movements are getting stronger and stronger, and in clubs in Wrocław or Warsaw, they are so-called the Polish brigades. I don't know how to even translate it correctly into English, who are discouraging Polish girls of having relations with the black students who are present in the clubs. There is a lot of things that needs to be done in order to convince the ordinary people that Africa is not only Egypt or Hurghada where we are going, but that's a big continent, and this paradigm shift shall also take place in the public.